A lion approached a forest ranger for help. What he found was terrifying. The lion shouldn't have been standing still. That was the first thing Daniel Osei noticed. Not the size of the animal, not the mane dark as charcoal around its face, not even the fact that it was alone in the middle of the trail at 6:14 in the morning. What stopped Daniel's breath was the stillness. A full-grown male lion, 250 pounds of muscle and instinct, standing in the center of the dirt road like he was waiting for a bus. Daniel cut the engine. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your eardrums. 12 years patrolling the Makena Reserve in Zimbabwe had taught him to read animals the way other men read weather. A lion protecting a kill carries its weight forward, shoulders rolling low. A lion guarding females fans its ears back, tail flicking in short, irritated arcs. A lion about to charge gives you exactly 1 second of warning, a kind of electric stillness before the world collapses into speed and noise. This lion did none of those things. He simply looked at Daniel, amber eyes calm as still water, fixed on the truck with an expression Daniel could not name, and would spend weeks trying to describe to anyone who asked. Daniel reached for the radio. Standard protocol: report the sighting, confirm coordinates, wait for backup before approaching a solo male in an unpredictable posture. His thumb pressed the button. He didn't transmit. Something made him pause. Not bravery, not stupidity. Something quieter than either of those things. The lion's tail wasn't moving. No ground pawing, no vocalizing. The animal's posture wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even wary. It was patient. Daniel had never seen a lion look patient before. He turned the ignition. The truck engine kicked back to life with a diesel cough that should have sent the animal 3 steps sideways or deeper into the brush, or into a defensive posture. Instead, the lion's ears rotated forward, toward the sound. And then the animal did something Daniel still has trouble explaining when he tells this story. It took 2 steps toward the truck. Not a charge, not a provocation. 2 measured, deliberate steps, the way a person walks across a room to get your attention. And then it stopped. The distance between them was less than 30 feet. Daniel's hand rested on the tranquilizer gun mounted beside his seat. He did not pick it up. He sat perfectly still, engine idling, watching a predator watch him back. Neither of them moving. Both of them waiting for something the morning hadn't revealed yet. He didn't know it then, but that stillness was the last quiet moment the day would offer. What would you do if an apex predator looked at you not with hunger, but with something that felt impossibly like a plea? The lion walked away from him. That was the moment Daniel should have radioed in, locked the doors and waited. Any ranger with sense would have done exactly that. Instead, he watched the animal take 6 slow steps into the bush, stop and turn its head back toward the truck, the way a dog checks to see if you're following. Daniel had seen injured animals try to lead humans away from a threat. He had seen predators use movement to draw prey into unfamiliar ground. He had never seen anything like this. The lion moved again. 10 more steps. Stopped. Looked back. No aggression in the body. No tension in the haunches. The tail hung low and still, which in a lion means one of 2 things: calm, or a kind of focused concentration that exists just before violence. Daniel watched the tail for 30 seconds without blinking. It didn't move. He put the truck in gear. The decision violated 3 separate protocols, and Daniel knew all 3 by name. Solo pursuit of an unpredictable male. No confirmed backup en route, leaving the marked trail into uncharted vegetation. His supervisor would have pulled his badge for any one of them. He followed anyway. The bush thickened fast. Acacia thorns scraped the sides of the truck in long, slow drags that sounded like something trying to get in. The lion stayed ahead, never rushing, never stopping long enough to make Daniel feel certain about the distance. Always just visible, always just far enough. 40 meters, 30, 40 again. Daniel kept his speed under 10 kilometers an hour. Eyes split between the animal and the terrain. The ground here was uneven, cracked red earth broken by shallow gullies that could swallow a front axle without warning. He had driven this reserve for over a decade and did not recognize this particular stretch of land. That bothered him more than the lion did. The animal paused again at a denser cluster of mopane trees, where the canopy dropped low, and the light went gray and thin. It turned fully this time, not just the head, the whole body, and stood facing the truck with both eyes forward. Daniel stopped. He cut the engine again and sat in the sudden silence, listening. Wind through dry grass, something small moving in the branches above, and then, underneath all of it, something that didn't belong to the morning. A faint, rhythmic sound. Almost mechanical. He couldn't place it. The lion hadn't moved. It was watching him with that same unreadable patience from the road, only now the space between them felt different. Smaller. The trees pressed in from both sides. The gray light made the animal look enormous. Daniel's hand found the tranquilizer gun. He didn't pick it up. He opened the truck door instead. The ground told the story before his eyes did. Daniel stepped out of the truck and felt the earth shift slightly under his boot. Softer here than it should have been, the way soil gets when something heavy has been lying on it for a while. He looked down. A depression in the red dirt, roughly the size and shape of a large animal curled into itself. Around the edges, bent grass that hadn't sprung back yet. Something had been resting here. Recently. The lion stood 12 meters ahead, motionless between two mopane trees. Watching. Daniel moved slowly, the way he'd been trained. No sudden gestures. No direct eye contact held too long. Weight forward on the balls of his feet. The tranquilizer gun hung in his right hand, barreled toward the ground. He wasn't ready to raise it. Raising it would mean he'd already lost control of the situation. He wasn't ready to admit that either. The smell reached him before anything else. Not the sharp copper smell of a fresh kill. Something older than that. Darker. The smell of blood that had already begun to dry in the heat, layered under something medicinal and wrong. Daniel had worked enough poaching scenes to know that smell. It lived in the back of the throat long after you left. He moved left, keeping the truck in his peripheral vision. Angling toward the dense brush the lion seemed to be guarding without quite guarding. No territorial display. No warning vocalizations. The animal simply stood and watched with those amber eyes, tail hanging still, breath moving its flanks in long, slow rhythms. Daniel pushed through the outer edge of the brush with his forearm. The blood on the ground was dark brown at the edges and rust red at the center. The pattern of it spread in a rough radius that told him the source hadn't moved much. Not a chase, not a struggle, something stationary, bleeding steadily. He crouched and studied it, without touching. The quantity was serious but not catastrophic. Not the volume of something that had already bled out. Whatever was bleeding was still bleeding. He straightened and pushed deeper. The brush opened into a small clearing no wider than his truck, canopied by interlocking branches that turned the morning light into something green and dim. And there, half hidden by a wall of dead vegetation that had been piled in a loose tangle, whether by wind or by human hands he couldn't tell yet, was the source of the sound he'd heard from the cab. A low, broken sound. Not a growl. Not a cry. Something in between. The sound of a creature that had been making noise for a long time and was running out of the strength to keep doing it. Daniel went very still. Behind him, the adult lion made a sound he had never heard from the species before. Not a roar, not a warning cough. A low, resonant exhale, and almost like a word in a language Daniel didn't speak but somehow understood. He turned slowly and found the animal had moved to the edge of the clearing, close enough now that Daniel could see the individual hairs of the dark mane, the pale scar tissue along the left jaw, the way the amber eyes moved between Daniel and the hidden source of the sound. Back and forth, back and forth. Daniel turned back to the brush and crouched down until he could see beneath the lowest branches. His eyes adjusted to the deep shadow. He saw the paw first, small, unmistakably young, the fur matted and dark with blood, then the steel jaw of the trap, rusted at the hinge but holding fast, clamped above the ankle joint with the specific, engineered cruelty of a device built to hold something much larger. Then the cub's eyes, open, looking directly at him. Daniel exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, the way you breathe when you cannot afford to show fear or urgency, or the particular kind of rage that was building behind his sternum like pressure behind a closed door. He had seen poaching equipment before. He had filed the reports, photographed the carcasses, testified at the hearings. He had never knelt in the dirt 3 feet from a living animal caught in one, and felt the full weight of what that meant. He reached for his radio. The radio call was short and precise. Coordinates, situation, equipment needed. Daniel kept his voice flat the way he'd learned to in his first year on the reserve, when his supervisor told him that panic in your voice travels down the line and multiplies on the other end. 2 Rangers confirmed. 12 minutes out. 12 minutes was a long time. He stayed crouched at the edge of the clearing, close enough to monitor the cub but not close enough to cause it to thrash. Movement against the trap would worsen the wound. He had seen animals lose a limb that way, not to the steel itself, but to their own desperation against it. The cub was beyond that stage. It had been in the trap long enough to exhaust the instinct to fight. It lay on its side now, breathing in shallow, uneven pulls. The injured paw extended at an angle that made something in Daniel's chest go tight. Behind him, the adult male had settled into a low crouch at the clearing's edge, not threatening, not retreating, simply present in the way that certain creatures are present, with a weight and an attention that fills the available space completely. Daniel was aware of the animal the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly at it, never forgetting it was there. He used the 12 minutes to look at what surrounded him. That was when the situation changed. The first additional trap was 4 meters to his left, buried under a thin layer of red dirt and dead leaves, the steel trigger plate barely visible if you knew what you were looking for. Daniel found it because he was looking for it, because a single trap in this location made no sense, and things that make no sense in the bush usually mean you're only seeing part of the picture. He marked it without touching it and kept scanning. Second trap, 7 meters north, wedged between 2 roots at the base of a mopane tree, chain anchored deep, set for something that would run toward the tree line when startled. Third trap, partially dismantled, as if someone had begun to retrieve it and stopped. Recent disturbance in the soil around it, boot prints partial, the heel deeper than the toe, someone who'd been moving fast. Daniel stood in the center of what he now understood was not a single incident, but a system. The traps were positioned with knowledge of animal movement patterns in this specific corridor, the natural path large predators used when moving between the eastern waterhole and the ridge shelter. Whoever placed them had spent time here, had watched, had planned. The cub had not wandered into a trap. The trap had been placed where the cub would be. The adult male had not followed Daniel by chance. He had gone to the road, the only place in this part of the reserve where humans reliably appeared, and waited. Daniel thought about the patience in those amber eyes on the trail, and felt the ground shift slightly beneath his understanding of the morning. The rangers arrived in a second vehicle, moving fast through the brush with the bolt cutters and the med kit and the portable restraint equipment. Daniel briefed them in 40 seconds. The younger one, a man named Sifo who had joined the reserve 8 months ago, looked at the cub and then at the adult male at the clearing's edge, and then back at Daniel with an expression that asked a question he didn't know how to put into words. Daniel didn't have an answer for it anyway. The extraction was controlled but not clean. The cub cried out once when the bolt cutters engaged the trap mechanism, a raw, high sound that cut through the clearing and seemed to travel up through the canopy and out into the open sky. The adult male rose instantly from his crouch, every muscle in his body hardening into attention, a sound building low in his chest that was not quite a growl, but was made of the same material. Nobody moved. The sound faded. The male held position. His eyes were on the cub. Sifo released the trap on the second attempt. Daniel had the wound packed with field dressing before the cub's breathing had fully settled. The paw was bad, the joint compromised, the tissue damage significant, but the blood loss had slowed, and the animal was conscious and responding to stimulus. It would need veterinary intervention within the hour. The prognosis beyond that was something nobody said out loud. Daniel straightened and looked at the adult male across the clearing. 12 feet between them. No barrier. The lion looked back at him with those same amber eyes from the road, and Daniel noticed something he hadn't seen before, a dullness at the edges of them that might have been exhaustion, or something that, in a human face, you would have called relief. He reached for his radio again. The reserve director needed to hear what he'd found here. Not just the cub, not just the traps, all of it, because 3 traps in a single corridor, placed with this level of knowledge and precision, did not belong to a single poacher working alone on a bad afternoon. This was something organized, something ongoing, and if there were 3 traps in this clearing, there were more somewhere else. The Day the Lion Didn't Attack, Chapter 5. The Risk. The director's voice on the radio was calm in the way that people in authority get calm when the information they're receiving is worse than they expected. Short questions, long pauses, the kind of listening that means someone on the other end is already making decisions before you finish the sentence. Daniel gave him everything. The trap positions, the boot prints, the corridor pattern, the cub's condition. He kept his voice flat and his language precise, and when he was done there was a silence on the line that lasted 4 full seconds before the director told him to hold position, secure the animal, and wait for the veterinary team currently 40 minutes out from the southern gate. 40 minutes. Daniel looked at the cub wrapped in the field dressing on the floor of the clearing, looked at Sifo crouched beside it, one hand resting lightly near the animal's flank, not touching, just present. Looked at the adult male still holding position at the clearing's edge, watching everything with that exhausted, unblinking attention. 40 minutes was a long time. The problem wasn't the wait. The problem was the tranquilizer decision, and Daniel had been turning it over in his mind since the moment the cub cried out. Protocol was clear. Sedate the adult male before any extended contact with a juvenile in distress. A lion responding to the sounds and smells of an injured cub was unpredictable in ways that even experienced rangers could not fully anticipate. The chemistry of it, the combination of territorial instinct, protective drive, and the particular agitation of an animal that had been operating under sustained stress, created a behavioral profile that the protocol described, with characteristic understatement, as elevated risk. Daniel knew all of this. He also knew what the sedation would mean in practical terms. A lion the size and weight of this male, dart hit in an uncontrolled environment, could travel 30 meters before going down, could fall badly, could aspirate. In the dense brush of this clearing, with the terrain uneven and the canopy low, a 250-pound animal dropping without warning created its own category of danger, for the lion, for Sifo, for the cub already on the ground, and a sedated male in a poaching corridor, in a reserve that now clearly had active human intrusion, was a lion that could not defend itself for the next 4 to 6 hours. Daniel held the dart gun and did not raise it. Sifo looked up at him once and said nothing. He understood the calculation without being told. That was the thing about working the bush long enough. You stopped needing to explain the hard choices out loud. They existed in the air between people who had made them before. The cub's breathing had steadied slightly. Not strong, but consistent. It had stopped trying to lift its head, which could mean it was weakening or could mean it had reached the particular stillness of a young animal conserving everything it had left for the things that mattered. Daniel had seen both. He couldn't tell which this was. 22 minutes in, the adult male moved. Not toward them, not away. He shifted his position along the clearing's edge, moving in a slow arc that took him from the northern side to the eastern side, placing himself between the clearing and the direction the boot prints had come from. Daniel watched this without moving and felt something cold settle into his thinking. The lion wasn't reacting to the humans in the clearing. He was watching the bush behind them. Daniel straightened slowly and turned his attention to the tree line the male was now facing. Nothing visible. No sound beyond the ordinary register of the afternoon. Insects, wind, a bird moving through the upper canopy somewhere to the west. But the lion's ears were forward and his body was carrying a tension that had not been there a minute ago. The kind of muscle-deep alertness that in Daniel's experience meant the animal had registered something through channels of perception that had no human equivalent. He moved to Sifo and spoke quietly. "Get the cub into the truck. Now. Don't rush it. Just move." Sifo didn't ask why. Daniel kept his eyes on the tree line and his hand on the dart gun, and listened to the sounds of Sifo carefully lifting the wrapped cub and moving toward the vehicle with the particular focused slowness of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing they could do right now was hurry. The adult male didn't turn, didn't shift his attention from whatever he was tracking in the eastern brush. His tail had begun to move, a slow rhythmic sweep just above the ground, the first time it had moved since Daniel had encountered him on the road 3 hours ago. The veterinary team arrived 7 minutes later from the southern approach, which meant they came from the wrong direction and announced themselves with engine noise before Daniel could reach them on the radio. The adult male swung around at the sound, the tension in his body spiking instantly, and Daniel had the dart gun raised before he made the conscious decision to raise it. The lion looked at him. The dart gun was aimed at the center of the male's shoulder, 6 meters between them, a clean shot in decent light. Daniel's finger was on the trigger. The lion held eye contact with him for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then the amber eyes moved to the truck where the cub was, and then back to Daniel, and the tail slowed. Daniel lowered the dart gun. He never entirely understood why. He told the story differently depending on who was asking. Sometimes he said the threat level dropped. Sometimes he said the angle was wrong. Sometimes he just said he made a call in the field, and left it at that. What he did not say, because it was not the kind of thing you put in an incident report, was that in that moment the lion had looked at him the way it had looked at him on the road that morning. Not with hunger, not with warning, with something that required a different word entirely, and Daniel had not found that word yet. The veterinary team came through the brush and the moment broke and everyone moved into their roles with the focused efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. and the clearing filled with controlled noise and purposeful movement, and the adult male retreated 4 steps into the tree line and stood there watching until the vehicles began to move. He did not follow. He stood at the edge of the clearing in the late afternoon light and watched them go, and Daniel watched him back through the rear window of the truck as the bush closed in around them, and the lion held position until the trees took him, and there was nothing there but green shadow and the sound of the reserve settling back into itself. The cub survived. That was the fact Daniel held on to in the days that followed, when everything else about the situation expanded into something far larger and harder to contain than a single morning in the bush. The veterinary team worked on the paw for 2 hours at the reserve's field station, while Daniel sat outside on a rusted metal chair and filled out the incident report with the specific, deliberate slowness of a man trying to make sure he got every word exactly right. The joint had been damaged, but not destroyed. 6 weeks of controlled recovery, restricted movement, monitored feeding, daily wound care. The lead veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Adaizi Nwosu, who had been working Southern African reserves for 20 years and was not given to dramatic statements, looked at the x-rays and told Daniel that another 4 hours in that trap would have changed the outcome entirely. Daniel wrote that down in the report too. Then he crossed it out. Then he wrote it again. The reserve director arrived at the field station that evening with 2 officers from the National Wildlife Crime Unit and a satellite map of the Eastern Corridor printed on paper so large it covered the entire briefing table. They had spent the afternoon doing what Daniel had not had the equipment or the backup to do in the field: a systematic sweep of the corridor and the surrounding terrain, moving in a grid pattern with metal detectors and 2 dogs trained specifically for buried steel. 17 traps in total, spread across a 2-kilometer stretch of the corridor in a pattern that told the wildlife crime officers, without any ambiguity, that this was not opportunistic poaching. This was infrastructure. Someone had invested time and money and specific knowledge of this reserve's geography into building a harvesting system designed to operate quietly over an extended period. The traps varied in size and design, some built for smaller animals, some engineered for something much larger. The largest ones, the officers said, were configured for lion. Daniel sat with that information for a moment before he responded to it. The boot prints from the clearing matched 2 additional sets of tracks found deeper in the corridor, converging at a point where the vegetation had been cut back in a rough circle, a staging area, the officers believed, used for processing and storage. Tire tracks nearby, a vehicle with a specific tread pattern that the crime unit photographed and logged, cigarette filters in the dirt, bagged as evidence, a piece of wire that had no business being this deep in a protected reserve, coiled neatly around a branch at chest height, as if someone had left it there to collect on the way back out. They hadn't come back out. Not yet. The director looked at Daniel across the briefing table and said that the evidence suggested the operation had been active for somewhere between 6 weeks and 3 months. Daniel thought about every morning patrol he had run in that period. Every route logged, every sighting recorded, every anomaly noted and investigated or not investigated, based on the judgment calls of a man doing 12-hour shifts across 400 square kilometers of terrain, with a team half the size it should have been. He didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the time for it. What he said was that they needed cameras in the Eastern Corridor by the end of the week, and motion sensors at the 2 most probable access points, and a protocol for irregular patrol timing that would make the reserve's human presence less predictable to anyone watching from outside the fence line. The director nodded. The wildlife crime officers wrote things down. The conversation moved forward the way these conversations do, into logistics and timelines and the particular bureaucratic machinery that gets activated when something that should have been caught earlier finally surfaces. 3 days later, the cameras went in. 4 days after that, one of them captured footage of a vehicle moving along the fence line at 2 a.m., slowing at the eastern access point and then accelerating away. The crime unit took the footage and said they were working on it. Daniel filed the report, forwarded the coordinates, and went back to his patrols. 9 days after the morning on the trail, a reserve monitor running a routine check on the recovery area sent Daniel a photograph on the staff radio channel without any accompanying message, just the image, the adult male, standing at the boundary of the monitored zone in the early morning light, mane catching the low sun, body angled toward the enclosure where the cub was being held, not attempting to enter, not vocalizing, simply present the way he had been present at the edge of the clearing, with that particular quality of attention that filled the available space and asked nothing in return. The cub was visible through the enclosure fencing in the background of the photograph, the bandaged paw tucked under its body, head up, oriented in the direction of the adult male. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time before he put his phone away. He thought about the road at 6:14 in the morning, the stillness that shouldn't have been stillness, the 2 steps toward the truck, the patience in the amber eyes that he still did not have a word for, and suspected he never would. He thought about the 17 traps and the staging area, and the tire tracks and the 6 weeks to 3 months that the operation had likely been running, and the particular corridor the traps had been placed in, and what it meant that an adult male lion had apparently decided at some point before Daniel arrived that morning that the situation required a solution he could not produce alone. Whether that was the right way to think about it, Daniel couldn't say for certain. What he could say was that the reserve's eastern corridor now had cameras and motion sensors and irregular patrol schedules, and a cub with a bandaged paw that was, according to Dr. Nwosu's last report, bearing weight again on the injured leg ahead of schedule, and that on the morning it happened, a lion stood in the middle of a dirt road and waited, not for food, not to establish dominance, not for any of the reasons lions stop and wait in the middle of roads in the early morning in reserves across southern Africa, for a truck, for a specific truck, for the man inside it to be paying enough attention to notice that something was wrong. The question that stayed with Daniel, the one he turned over during the long patrol hours in the weeks and months that followed, the one he still had not satisfactorily answered, was not whether the lion had understood what he was doing. It was whether Daniel in the lion's position would have thought to do the same.